June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 a.m. The eastern sky above the Bug River explodes into fire. Over 3 million German soldiers storm across the border into the Soviet Union. Engines roar. Artillery shatters the dawn silence. Smoke rolls across the wheat fields like a curtain of death. Hitler believes he's about to crush communism in a matter of weeks. His generals promise victory before the leaves fall. But within 4 years, these same fields will be soaked with German blood, and his armies will lie shattered across 1,000 miles of frozen wasteland. How did the greatest invasion in history end in disaster? Turned Hitler's master plan into his greatest mistake. The plan begins years before the first shot is fired. Adolf Hitler sits in his study at the Berghof, staring at maps of Europe. It's 1940. France has fallen. Britain stands alone. The continent bows before the swastika, but Hitler isn't satisfied. His eyes track eastward, across Poland, across the marshes and forests, all the way to the Ural Mountains. He sees something his generals don't quite grasp yet, not just territory, but destiny. Lebensraum. Living space. The word carries weight in Nazi ideology, a twisted vision of German expansion that demands the conquest of the East. Hitler believes the Slavic peoples are inferior, their lands ripe for colonization, their resources essential for the 1,000-year Reich. But there's more than racism driving this obsession. There's ideology. The Soviet Union represents everything Hitler despises: communism, Bolshevism, what he calls the Jewish Marxist conspiracy. Destroying the USSR isn't just strategic, it's existential. And then there are the resources. Ukraine's wheat fields, the oil of the Caucasus, the minerals of the Urals. Germany's war machine devours fuel and steel. Without these resources, Hitler knows his empire cannot sustain a long war. The Soviet Union holds the key to autarky, to self-sufficiency, to making Germany invincible. So on December 18th, 1940, Hitler signs Führer Directive No. 21, its codename Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval emperor who marched east on crusade. The directive is clear: the German armed forces must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, even before the conclusion of the war against England. Quick campaign. Those two words will haunt the Wehrmacht for the next 4 years. But why does Hitler believe this is possible? The German military has just executed the most stunning victories in modern warfare. Poland fell in weeks. Denmark and Norway collapsed. France, the great military power that held the line for 4 years in World War I, surrendered in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht seems unstoppable, a perfectly coordinated machine of tanks, aircraft, and infantry executing blitzkrieg lightning war with surgical precision. Hitler looks at the Soviet Union and sees weakness. Stalin's purges have gutted the Red Army's officer corps. Thousands of experienced commanders shot, imprisoned, disappeared into the Gulag. The Winter War against tiny Finland exposed Soviet incompetence. It took the Red Army months and hundreds of thousands of casualties to defeat a nation of less than 4 million people. Hitler tells his generals that they need only kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. His intelligence services agree. The Wehrmacht estimates the Red Army has about 200 divisions. They're wrong by millions of men, but they don't know that yet. They believe Soviet industry is primitive. Soviet morale is fragile. Soviet logistics are chaotic. On paper, it looks like another lightning victory waiting to happen. The plan itself is massive, audacious, unprecedented in scale. 3 army groups. Army Group North will drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center will smash through Belarus toward Moscow. Army Group South will sweep through Ukraine toward Kiev and the oil fields beyond. Together, they'll command 3.3 million German troops, supplemented by Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces. Over 600,000 vehicles, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,500 aircraft. It's the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history. The attack will open with a devastating artillery barrage, followed by armored spearheads that will penetrate deep into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying Red Army units before they can retreat or reorganize. The Luftwaffe will achieve air superiority in hours, bombing airfields, command posts, communication lines. Panzer divisions will race ahead, cutting off entire Soviet armies in massive pockets of encirclement. Infantry will follow, mopping up resistance, securing territory, moving supplies forward. The timeline? 4 months. Maybe 5. Before winter, certainly. Before the mud and snow make roads impassable. The Wehrmacht plans to reach a line from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan, the AA line stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Beyond this line, Soviet industry will be crippled, Soviet resistance will collapse, and the war will be won. But there's a problem hidden in the plan, a flaw so fundamental that it will doom the entire operation. The Wehrmacht is planning a short war of annihilation, but they're invading the largest country on earth. The distances are staggering. From the German border to Moscow, 1,000 kilometers. From the border to the Caucasus, 2,000 kilometers. The entire front will stretch 2,900 kilometers from north to south. For comparison, the invasion of France covered roughly 400 kilometers. And these aren't just any kilometers. These are Russian kilometers across swamps, forests, dirt roads that turn to liquid mud with rain. The Soviet Union has very few paved highways. The railroad gauge is different from European standard, meaning German trains can't run on Soviet tracks without modification. The Wehrmacht is about to advance with horse-drawn supply wagons into the age of mechanized warfare's greatest challenge. But on the morning of June 22, 1941, none of these concerns slow the invasion. At 3:15 a.m., the artillery opens fire. Along the entire front, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, German guns unleash a rolling barrage that lights up the horizon. Soviet border posts are obliterated. Communication lines are cut. Command centers are destroyed. Within minutes, German bombers cross the border, hitting Soviet airfields, while aircraft are still lined up on the ground, wings touching, perfect targets. The Soviet Air Force loses 1,200 aircraft on the first day. Most never leave the ground. Then the tanks roll forward. Panzer divisions cross the Bug River on pontoon bridges, their engines roaring, their guns firing. Soviet frontier guards fight desperately, but they're overwhelmed. The initial defensive positions are breached within hours. By noon, German armored columns are 50 kilometers into Soviet territory. By sunset, they're nearing 100 kilometers. Nothing seems to stop them. And the soldiers? They're confident, almost euphoric. They've trained for this moment. They've conquered half of Europe. This is supposed to be the easy part, the final great campaign before Germany dominates the continent. Soldiers write letters home, predicting they'll be in Moscow by August, back in Berlin by Christmas. The early victories seem to confirm Hitler's prophecy. By June 28, just 6 days into the invasion, Army Group Center surrounds Minsk, the capital of Belarus. The encirclement traps over 300,000 Soviet soldiers. Entire Soviet divisions simply cease to exist. By mid-July, the Germans have captured or destroyed over 2 million tons of Soviet ammunition, 3,500 tanks, 6,000 guns. The Red Army appears to be disintegrating. At Smolensk in August, another massive encirclement nets 300,000 more prisoners. In Ukraine, Kiev falls in September with 665,000 Soviet soldiers captured, the single largest encirclement in military history. By December 1941, the Germans will have taken over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. It's carnage on an unimaginable scale. Hitler is jubilant. On July 3rd, just 11 days into the invasion, Chief of the German General Staff Franz Halder writes in his diary, "It is thus probably no overstatement to say that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks. 2 weeks, the entire war, decided, or so they think. But if the Wehrmacht advanced so fast, if they captured millions of Soviet soldiers, if they destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft, why didn't they win?" The answer begins with something the Germans didn't expect. The Soviet Union refuses to collapse. Every previous invasion, Poland, France, the Low Countries, followed a pattern: breakthrough, encirclement, collapse of command structure, surrender. Nations had breaking points: capture the capital, destroy the main army, and the war ends. The Wehrmacht is designed for this kind of conflict, a sharp, decisive blow that forces capitulation. But the Soviet Union doesn't break. It bends, bleeds, reels backward, but it doesn't shatter. Part of the reason is Stalin. On July 3rd, 1941, nearly 2 weeks after the invasion begins, Stalin finally addresses the Soviet people by radio. His voice is strained, almost broken, but his message is clear. This is not just a war between armies. This is a war of annihilation against the Soviet people. He calls it the Great Patriotic War, invoking memories of the 1812 defense against Napoleon. He orders scorched earth destroy everything that might aid the Germans: factories, bridges, crops, livestock, leave nothing behind. And then he promises something that will define the conflict: no retreat, no surrender, fight to the last. Soviet commanders who retreat without orders face execution. Soldiers who surrender are branded traitors. Their families lose their rations. The message is brutal but effective. There is no option except resistance. The Soviet people respond. Millions volunteer for the Red Army. Workers stay at their factory posts even as German tanks appear on the horizon. In Leningrad, citizens build fortifications with their bare hands. The war becomes existential in a way Hitler's generals never anticipated. You can't negotiate with a nation that refuses to acknowledge defeat. But human will alone doesn't stop panzers. The Soviets need something more tangible, and they find it in a decision made months before the war begins. Starting in 1940, Soviet industry begins a massive relocation effort. As the Germans advance, entire factories are dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped east beyond the Ural Mountains, into Siberia, into Central Asia. Machines, workers, engineers, raw materials. By the end of 1941, over 1,500 factories have been relocated. They're reassembled in cities like Magnitogorsk, Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, far beyond the reach of German bombers. Within months, these factories are producing tanks, aircraft, ammunition. The T-34 tank, superior to most German armor, rolls off assembly lines by the thousands. Katyusha rocket launchers, artillery, rifles. The Soviet war economy, instead of collapsing, begins to accelerate. Germany might be winning battles, but the Soviet Union is winning the production war. And then there's the manpower issue, the numbers that haunt German planners as autumn approaches. Before Barbarossa, German intelligence estimates the Red Army has about 200 divisions. By August 1941, the Germans have already identified and engaged 360 divisions. Where are they coming from? The answer is simple and terrifying. The Soviet Union is enormous, with a population of nearly 200 million people. Even catastrophic losses can be replaced. Germany, with 70 million people and commitments across Western Europe, North Africa, and now the vast Eastern Front, cannot match this. The Wehrmacht is destroying Soviet armies faster than any military in history, but new Soviet armies keep appearing. General Halder, so confident in July, writes in his diary in August, "We have underestimated the Russian colossus." But the most immediate threat to the German advance isn't Soviet resistance, it's distance and weather. By late August 1941, Army Group Center has advanced 700 kilometers into Soviet territory. This creates a logistical nightmare. German supply lines now stretch across hundreds of kilometers of primitive roads. Fuel trucks consume their own cargo just driving to the front. Ammunition runs low. Spare parts for tanks and vehicles become scarce. The Wehrmacht's motorized units are immobilized, not by Soviet counterattacks, but by broken axles, empty fuel tanks, worn-out engines. And then there's the horses. Yes, horses. For all its mechanized glory, the Wehrmacht still relies on horse-drawn transport for much of its logistics. Over 600,000 horses accompany the invasion. They need food, water, rest. As the campaign drags on, horses die by the thousands, overwork, disease, Soviet cavalry raids. Units that should be advancing are stuck, waiting for supplies that never arrive. Then the autumn rains begin. September 1941. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Dirt roads, already degraded by millions of boots and vehicle tracks, dissolve into rivers of liquid earth. Tanks sink up to their turrets. Trucks become stuck, abandoned. Soldiers wade through knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep mud, hauling supplies forward on their backs. A panzer division that should cover 50 kilometers in a day struggles to move 5. Hitler is furious. He orders Army Group Center to push toward Moscow Operation Typhoon, the final thrust to capture the Soviet capital before winter. The offensive begins on October 2nd, 1941. Initially, it succeeds. Another massive encirclement at Vyazma traps 600,000 more Soviet soldiers. The road to Moscow seems open, but the mud slows everything. What should take 2 weeks takes 5. By the time German forward units reach the outskirts of Moscow in late November, something else has arrived. Winter, November 1941. Temperatures plunge below freezing. Snow begins to fall. German soldiers are still wearing summer uniforms. The Wehrmacht didn't plan for a winter campaign, remember. This was supposed to be over by autumn. Troops stuff newspapers into their jackets for insulation. Frostbite becomes epidemic. Sentries freeze to death at their posts. The cold does something worse to equipment. Tank engines seize, oil congeals, weapons jam, artillery recoil mechanisms freeze solid. Vehicles won't start without lighting fires underneath the engines. Soldiers smash ice off machine guns to make them operational. The Wehrmacht, so mechanically sophisticated, is being defeated by thermometers reading the 30 degrees Celsius and below. And the Soviets? They're prepared. Winter uniforms, felt boots, white camouflage, tanks designed to operate in extreme cold. Ski troops who can move across snowdrifts. The Red Army isn't just defending Moscow, it's counterattacking. But before we talk about the Soviet counteroffensive, there's another disaster unfolding, one that mirrors what will happen at Stalingrad a year later. The Wehrmacht is overextended, undersupplied, and trapped between Hitler's insistence on advancing and the reality that they cannot hold what they've taken. In early December 1941, German reconnaissance units actually reach the suburbs of Moscow. They can see the Kremlin towers through their binoculars. They're 19 kilometers from the city center, but they have no reserves, no fuel, no winter clothing, and no way to take the city. The offensive stalls not because of Soviet resistance, although that's fierce, but because the Wehrmacht has reached the absolute limit of its logistical capability. And then, on December 5th, 1941, everything changes. December 5th, 1941. The temperature at the Moscow front drops to 35 degrees Celsius. German soldiers huddle in improvised shelters, trying to stay alive. And then, out of the frozen darkness, comes the Soviet counteroffensive. General Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most capable commander, has assembled fresh divisions from Siberia and Central Asia troops trained for winter warfare, equipped with proper clothing, mounted on skis. The Soviet plan is ambitious. Strike at the overextended German flanks north and south of Moscow, cut off the forward spearheads, and drive the Wehrmacht back. The attack comes as a shock. The Germans believed the Red Army was finished, incapable of major operations. Intelligence reports suggested the Soviets had no reserves left. They were catastrophically wrong. Zhukov throws 100 divisions, over 1 million men into the offensive. Soviet T-34 tanks, superior in the winter conditions, smash through defensive positions. German units, already weakened by frostbite and supply shortages, begin to retreat. Hitler issues a stand-fast order. No retreat, hold every position, fight to the last man. In some cases, this prevents a complete rout. In other cases, it condemns entire units to encirclement and destruction. The Wehrmacht, which has spent 6 months advancing, is now being pushed back for the first time since the war began. By January 1942, The Germans have been driven back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. The dream of capturing the Soviet capital is over. Operation Typhoon has failed. And with it, Operation Barbarossa has failed. The cost is staggering. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht has suffered approximately 750,000 casualties on the Eastern Front, dead, wounded, missing, captured. This is more than the German army's total losses in all previous campaigns combined. Over 8,000 tanks and assault guns are destroyed or disabled. Aircraft losses exceed 2,500. The Wehrmacht will never fully recover, but the human cost goes beyond military casualties. The invasion of the Soviet Union is also a war of extermination. Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units follow the Wehrmacht, murdering Jews, communists, intellectuals, anyone deemed an enemy of the Reich. Soviet prisoners of war are herded into open-air camps, given minimal food, no shelter. Of the 3 million Soviet POWs captured in 1941, nearly 2 million die by February 1942 from starvation, exposure, disease, execution. The brutality of the Nazi occupation ensures that Soviet resistance will be total, uncompromising, unforgiving. So why did Barbarossa fail? The question isn't simple. There's no single mistake, no one turning point. Instead, it's a cascade of failures, miscalculations, and fundamental strategic errors. First, intelligence. The Wehrmacht underestimated Soviet strength by millions of soldiers. They underestimated Soviet industrial capacity. They underestimated Soviet will to resist. These aren't minor errors, they're the foundation of the entire plan. If you build a strategy on false assumptions, no amount of tactical brilliance will save you. Second, logistics. The German army advanced so fast that its supply lines couldn't keep up. The Wehrmacht was designed for short, decisive campaigns, not sustained operations across continental distances. Fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, lack of winter clothing, these aren't accidents. They're the result of planning for a 6-month campaign that turns into a 4-year war. Third, the winter. Yes, the cold was worse than expected. But the real problem is that the Germans didn't expect to be fighting in winter at all. The plan required victory before autumn. When that didn't happen, the Wehrmacht found itself trapped too deep into Soviet territory to retreat, too weak to advance, and completely unprepared for the conditions they faced. Fourth, the size of the front. The Germans are trying to conquer and occupy territory on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. The Eastern Front eventually stretches over 2,900 kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's the distance from London to Baghdad. The Wehrmacht doesn't have enough troops to hold this territory, protect the supply lines, and maintain an effective offensive. They're spread impossibly thin. Fifth, and perhaps most fundamentally, Hitler's strategic vision is flawed. He believes the Soviet Union is weak, racially inferior, incapable of sustained resistance. He refuses to listen to warnings from his generals. When the initial plan fails, he doesn't adapt, he doubles down. He insists on holding ground, on no retreats, on ideological purity over military necessity. His interference in operational planning turns setbacks into disasters. But there's one more factor that seals Germany's fate. The war becomes global. On December 7th, 1941, just 2 days after the Soviet counteroffensive begins, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. On December 11th, Hitler declares war on the United States. This is arguably his second greatest mistake after Barbarossa itself. Germany is now fighting the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States, 3 of the most industrially powerful nations on Earth. The resource imbalance is overwhelming. The United States alone will produce more aircraft in 1944 than Germany and Japan combined. Soviet factories will churn out more tanks than Germany can destroy. The Wehrmacht will win more battles, but it cannot win the war. The numbers are impossible. And it all traces back to June 22nd, 1941. Barbarossa doesn't just fail to achieve its objectives, it ensures Germany's defeat. The Wehrmacht's best divisions are ground down in the Russian winter. The Luftwaffe loses air superiority. The myth of German invincibility is shattered. From December 1941 onward, Germany is fighting for survival, not victory. By spring 1942, the front stabilizes, but the nature of the war has changed. This is no longer a blitzkrieg, it's a war of attrition, and Germany cannot win a war of attrition. The Wehrmacht tries another offensive in summer 1942, pushing towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. It ends in the catastrophic encirclement and surrender of the 6th Army at Stalingrad, another 300,000 German casualties. In summer 1943, the Germans try again at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. They lose. From that point forward, the Red Army is always advancing, slowly, bloodily, at tremendous cost, but always forward. By 1944, Soviet forces are pushing into Eastern Europe. By April 1945, they're in Berlin. The irony is brutal. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union to secure living space, resources, and ideological dominance. Instead, he unleashed a war that destroys the Third Reich, leaves Germany divided and occupied, and turns the Soviet Union into a superpower. The invasion that was supposed to last 4 months lasts 4 years and costs Germany everything. The human cost is almost incomprehensible. On the Eastern Front alone, from 1941 to 1945, an estimated 10 million Soviet soldiers die. Another 15 to 20 million Soviet civilians die from combat, starvation, disease, genocide. German military deaths on the Eastern Front approach 4 to 5 million. The scale of death dwarfs any other theatre of World War II. And it begins with a single decision. Hitler's belief that he can conquer the Soviet Union in a quick campaign before winter arrives. What's the legacy of Operation Barbarossa? First, military. The failure of Barbarossa proves that modern industrialized warfare cannot be won by tactical brilliance alone. Logistics matters. Industrial capacity matters. Population size matters. The Germans won nearly every tactical engagement in 1941, and it didn't matter. They couldn't replace their losses. They couldn't sustain their advance. They couldn't conquer a nation that simply refused to surrender. Second, political. Barbarossa transforms World War II from a European conflict into a global war of annihilation. It brings the Soviet Union into the war as an allied power. It sets the stage for the Cold War, as Soviet forces occupy Eastern Europe and refuse to leave. The world that emerges after 1945, divided between capitalism and communism, is directly shaped by Hitler's decision to invade in 1941. Third, moral. The invasion of the Soviet Union is explicitly a war of annihilation. Nazi ideology views Slavs as subhuman, Jews as vermin, communists as existential enemies. The Wehrmacht is complicit in massacres, starvation, genocide. The Holocaust escalates dramatically after Barbarossa begins. The Einsatzgruppen operate in the wake of the German advance, murdering over 1 million Jews by the end of 1941. The Nazi regime doesn't just want to conquer the Soviet Union, it wants to erase it. The failure of Barbarossa doesn't just doom Hitler's military ambitions, it dooms his entire ideological project. The 1,000-year Reich lasts 12 years. The invasion meant to secure Germany's future instead guarantees its destruction. So what should we take away from this? Operation Barbarossa is often called Hitler's greatest mistake, but that's not quite accurate. It's not a mistake in the sense of an error in judgment. It's the inevitable result of Nazi ideology, the belief in racial superiority, the contempt for Slavic peoples, the certainty that will and ideology can overcome material reality. Hitler doesn't stumble into failure. He charges toward it, convinced that his vision of history will prevail. The Wehrmacht was one of the most effective fighting forces in history. German soldiers and officers were skilled, disciplined, experienced. German technology was often superior. German tactics were innovative. None of it was enough, because at the strategic level, the entire operation was built on delusion. You cannot conquer the largest country on Earth with a 4-month timeline. You cannot sustain a front spanning thousands of kilometers without adequate logistics. You cannot defeat an enemy with nearly 3 times your population and unlimited industrial depth, and you cannot win a war where your ideology guarantees that the enemy will fight to the death rather than surrender. Barbarossa fails because it had to fail. The only question was how long it would take and how many people would die before that failure became undeniable. Thank you for joining us today. Before you go, tell me in the comments, what's the most surprising detail you learned from this story? Was it the scale of the invasion, the logistical collapse, the Soviet relocation of factories, or Hitler's refusal to prepare for winter? Your insights make this community stronger. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.